Fred Taylor was a bricklayer from Erdington, Birmingham. During the 1930s, built two aeroplanes. The first was a motorised glider, largely based on the design of a primary glider, or dagling as they are generally known in England. It incorporated a small amount of fittings from a glider previously built by the Midlands Model Aeroplane Club, of which Fred and his younger brother Ernie were members, the club glider having been written off by a learner. The airframe of Fred's aeroplane was largely built from pine and plywood in the upstairs front bedroom of the Taylors' home in Perry Common Road. Having looked at several propellers in the hangar at Castle Bromwich, Fred carved his own, bolting it directly to the crankshaft of a 350cc Douglas twin motorcycle engine fitted behind the seat. The completed machine was trial rigged in the back garden, the 30-foot wingspan cheerfully overhanging next door. A local farmer, Bill Breeden, was a member of the Midlands Aero Club at Castle Bromwich and also ran his own flying field at Dunton Hall, a couple of miles northeast of Castle Bromwich. The field was popular with club members at weekends, and Farmer Breeden offered Fred free use of a barn and the field. In fact, this agreeable arrangement continued until the late 1940s. Early test flights, mostly flown by Ernie, were disappointing, the direct-drive Douglas not producing enough thrust for sustained flight. Fred bought a derelict Morgan three-wheeler for 5 shillings and, using a stub axle and front hub assembly, fashioned a 2-to-1 chain reduction drive. With a new, larger diameter homemade propeller, the Douglas now provided enough thrust, and test flying continued. Fred, pleased with progress, named the aircraft the Taylor A101 Bedstead, a bed frame having provided metal for fittings. Fred and Ernie both taught themselves to fly on the Bedstead. There were several minor crashes, but no one was hurt. Flying continued until late 1935, when Ernie crashed the machine properly. Ernie was unhurt, but he left home in 1936 to join the RAF, and another teenager, Len Bracey, assisted Fred in the workshop. The bedstead was completely rebuilt, the cockpit being lowered and enclosed in a nacelle, and a new, larger fin, rudder and tail wheel fitted. The 1000cc Jap V-twin from the Morgan was also installed in place of the Douglas. In this form, and christened the Taylor B102 Bedstead Mark II, it flew well, the direct-drive Jap providing ample thrust. However, the V-twin, with its out-of-balance forces, also created a lot of vibration. There was no cure other than a change of engine. Fred bought another Douglas engine, a 500cc racing unit. With a 2-to-1 chain reduction unit and yet another homemade propeller, the Douglas proved very satisfactory. Fred started flying higher and further, although it wasn't long before he made his way into the news. The petrol tap was not within reach of the seated pilot, and it vibrated to the closed position. Fred flew through a hedge on the subsequent forced landing, although damage was minimal, subsequent repairs costing 2 shillings. It all made good copy, and the Flying Bricklayer name rather stuck. Fred later modified the ailerons and lost control of the bedstead near the ground, cartwheeling to a stop. He wasn't injured, but the machine was a write-off. Even before the accident, Fred had drawn up plans for another machine. Bedstead 2 was dismantled for parts and materials, including the undamaged Douglas engine, and the new airframe started taking shape in the front bedroom. A conventional parasol monoplane, it was decided to build the fuselage in 2 halves, with a joint just behind the cockpit, not for any aeronautical reason, but to negotiate a 90-degree bend in the staircase from the bedroom workshop. When complete, Fred and Len towed the aircraft parts to Dunton Hall on a homemade trailer behind bicycles. In spite of only using hand tools, the airframe was completed in less than 12 months, and unusually for a simple home-built ultralight, included the ability to fold the wings. Fitted with the 500cc Douglas engine and a new tractor propeller, the complete aircraft weighed 250 pounds empty. Test flying revealed a few minor faults. Wing and centre section incidence was reduced, and the undercarriage was modified, the cable bracing being replaced by metal tubes and long travel soft suspension provided by rubber bands cut from a motorcar inner tube. This proved entirely satisfactory. Fred christened the aircraft the Taylor C103 Wagtail, and it caused much interest at Dunton Hall. One admirer, Harold Willis, chief engineer of the Velocette Motorcycle Company, gave Fred a set of racing spark plugs for the engine. Willis thought them more suitable than the ancient KLG plugs Fred was using, but in fact the engine failed when they were tried, Fred having the first of several forced landings. As with the bedstead, the Wagtail wasn't registered, nor did Fred have a license. This was entirely legal as long as Fred stayed within a 3-mile radius of his takeoff point. At times, the Douglas engine was capricious, and Fred wished to replace it with a proper aero engine. He tried to buy a Bristol Cherub from his friend Don Burgoyne, but Burgoyne was stockpiling them for his fleet of BAC drones. However, Burgoyne agreed to lending Fred a Scott engine. It was nearly new, only crashed twice. The Scott was tried on the Wagtail, the Douglas propeller being adapted with plywood plates. During the takeoff roll, the adapted propeller split, one blade narrowly missing Charlie Botterell's head. Out of balance forces tore the Scott engine from the mount, but there was no further damage. The engine was returned to Burgoyne as unsuitable, and the Douglas engine reinstated. In September 1939, the Wagtail was dismantled and carefully stored away in Farmer Breeden's barn. Fred Taylor, being a skilled bricklayer, was not called up during World War II. He tried to join the Royal Air Force and the Air Transport Auxiliary, both unsuccessfully. In 1945, Len Bracey returned from RAF service overseas. He and Fred unearthed the Wagtail from the barn, no worse the wear for its several years' storage. Don Burgoyne, having been cured of his drone kleptomania, agreed to selling Fred a Bristol Cherub. The Cherub needed new pistons, but Fred, who by now worked in a foundry, simply cast his own from a pair of scrap Merlin pistons provided by Len. The Cherub-engined Wagtail proved to be a fine and reliable performer, everything Fred had wished for 10 years before. Unfortunately, it was also illegal. The Ultralight Aircraft Association tried to help, but the Wagtail, built perfectly legally pre-war, would not be issued with a permit to fly as it was built from unapproved materials. Some enthusiasts did persist. Robert Parker spent 3 years from 1946 to 1949 lobbying the Air Ministry for a permit to fly for his Heath Parasol. When they eventually issued a permit, it was valid for a whole 12 days. The ever-resourceful Fred had a simple solution. He painted the aircraft's serial number, C103, on the side of the fuselage. He flew quite safely for the next 4 years, including cross-country flights to Castle Bromwich and to Elmdon, now Birmingham Airport. Len Bracey, who'd had a couple of hours duel in a Tiger Moth, also flew the Wagtail on many occasions. However, this all came to an end in 1950, when Fred sold the Wagtail to a Mr. Harrison and emigrated with his family to Australia. After a few years in Australia, Fred decided to build himself another Wagtail. The aircraft was completed, but the Australian authorities were no more helpful than the British authorities had been. Fred's solution was predictably simple. He waited until the authorities had retreated to a safe distance, painted C104 on the side of the Wagtail, and went flying. Fred Taylor died in 1984, aged 78. In the late 1960s, correspondents in the Birmingham Daily Post pondered the fate of the Wagtail. After being sold to Mr. Harrison, it was displayed on a second-hand car lot in Digbeth, Birmingham. Sold to a councillor Bevan, it was started up and ran at full throttle into a wall. The engine was saved, but the remains were burned. One of the many letters sent in was from Len Bracey, who recalled his friendship with Fred Taylor and his experiences flying the Wagtail. In the 1980s, Len Bracey recorded an audio history of the Wagtail. His son has digitized it, and it's available online. Link in the description. Len Bracey died in 1989. Dunton Hall Farm, with its flying field, duck pond and Dutch barn, still survives. It hasn't seen an aircraft for 70 years. Thank you for watching.